Welcome everybody to my presentation today. I will be doing this presentation on classical architecture and looking to discuss a little bit more in detail what we do refer to when we are talking about classical architecture and also how it influenced identity and changed the way ancient civilizations functioned within themselves. When we do tend to talk about classical architecture, we often do refer to the cities of ancient Greece and ancient Rome and the buildings that were constructed during those times, as they were quite revolutionary through their design itself as well as the construction methods used. The classical era has been idolised amongst the architectural and historical world, as architects at the time were able to create a form of identity, revolutionise spatial planning, encourage specific movements within their communities, and also place a degree of status upon the buildings that they constructed through ornamental and detailed design. For the classical architecture period, it is known to be divided into a number of eras themselves. Today's presentation will focus upon the Hellenic period, which was dated between 800 BC and 323 BC, the Hellenistic period, dated between 323 BC to 31 BC, as well as the Roman post 31 BC era, known as the Augustan era. During all these times, there were some quite extraordinary buildings and revolutionary buildings rather that were constructed, known as the Parthenon Temple, the Erechtheion Temple, and the Forum Romanum, all of which these buildings played major roles in economical and social growth of both of these city-states. Classical architecture is often quickly identified through the use of heavy limestone materials, ornate and detailed roof friezes, and mainly the Greek orders were a large part of both ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Each of these factors played a vital role in allowing communities to quickly identify the status and importance of a building as well as its function just by looking at it a lot of the times. Today's presentation will have a main focus on the advancements and impacts made on society through the Erechtheion Temple of Greece in Athens and the Forum Romanum, Forum of Italy in Rome. Firstly, when looking at the classical period, we often do refer straight to the buildings of the time that were built, although a critical factor in what makes these buildings important is actually their locations. We can see when looking at the surroundings of a temple or a marketplace why it may have been built in the area in which it was and what influenced the decision to build in that location. In ancient Greece, the communities would look at landscape and decide on the most holy areas to build upon particularly. These areas are referred to as sanctuaries. A sanctuary could have been decided upon due to a particular aspect of the land, be it a body of water, a tree, or maybe a mountain or a cave even, something with importance to that specific location. We've seen, for example, the Temple of Delphi, or rather known as the Temple of Apollo, was built on a patch of land where it was said that the god of Apollo had actually spoken before. One of the most important and famous sanctuaries is that of the Acropolis mountain due to its height in the landscape, and it was believed that due to its height, it was the closest point to the gods themselves. Sanctuary could not only serve as an area to build upon, but it could also serve as a purpose for gatherings and celebrations. Areas were defined into three subcategories being urban, rural, and extra-urban. An urban sanctuary, for example, you may find a marketplace or the ancient agora in Greece, and in rural settings, a field for athletic events similar to the ones that were used for the original Olympics, or possibly areas where gatherings of social nature and political nature occurred. It has been argued rather, that the development of political movements such as democracy was actually founded upon and motivated within these sanctuaries. During the 8th century BC, temples came to become a key factor during the classical period, and also how it transformed the way society functioned, and the internal layout of a space was quite revolutionary. Within the temples themselves, we began to see rooms with high divine value that would often hold divine artifacts and relics, and they would also be used as multi-purpose buildings, which was quite different to the traditional layout of a building at the time. Though their main functions were that of religious purposes and to honour various gods, they also acted as spaces for political, dining, social, and ritual gatherings, whilst also having some sacrificial and storage spaces included. It's within these designs of the temples that we witness architects using finer details to convey messages to the public and to initiate emotions of power and excellence. The columns in which hold the weight of the structure not only played a structural role, but also added to the significance and status of the temple, and assisting the citizens of the area to identify the function and the importance of the building itself. Developing in the 7th century BC and through to the 5th century BC, classical architecture was made up of three main columns. These were known as the Greek orders. The Greek orders are one of the most highly used and identifiable features of a classical building. Made from primarily limestone, these columns give us a feeling of class to architecture. Known as the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian orders, these were the most widely used, and each of these not only played a structural role in the building, but also provided a particular sense of significance and status to the building itself. Depending on the god that was being worshipped at the specific temple, architects would either include a Doric or Ionic order to coincide with the gender of the god being worshipped. Doric orders were associated at the time with the more masculine sense, and Ionic more of a feminine sense. For example, the Doric orders found on the Parthenon temple are built shorter and wider than the taller and slender Ionic orders. This was a key area in which a general population was able to identify the purpose of a temple simply by viewing it externally. The Erechtheion Temple is an unusual style temple, although it came to become one of the most important. Sitting on the north side of the Acropolis mountain, the Erechtheion serves to worship two gods in the one building. This was not a concept that had been seen before, as temples were usually constructed only dedicated to the one god. With the Acropolis mountain being regarded as possibly the most sacred of all the sanctuaries and locations, the Erechtheion was situated at the back of the mountain with the idea to create an open space in the center of the mountain for people to gather and worship, and also be able to view all the statues and artifacts and relics that were located on that mountain. The temple Erechtheion was designed by the ancient architect Mnesicles between 421 BC and 401 BC. The temple includes a west, east, and south section, where in the west area the god Athena Polias is worshipped, and in the east section the god Poseidon Erechtheus is worshipped. Along the southern porch of the temple is one of its most interesting features, and most identifiable rather, where instead of the Ionic columns that are featured along the other sides and facades of the building itself, we see 6 statues of women in their replacement. These statues are referred to as Cargatids, and the meaning has been speculated of these Cargatids and women over time. The first explanation that we have is that of Roman architect Marcus Vitruvius, who states that after Greece's victory in the city of Caryae during the Persian Wars, the Greeks aimed to instill a sense of permanent punishment for the citizens' crimes, and this is why the statues have replaced the columns so that they bear the weight of the structure. This has been argued over time though. We can see the way ancient architects were using sculpture and architecture to portray messages and further create identifiable features that would become known to be that of Greece. The temple was also known as a revolutionary design, as it was built upon multi-levels and served other purposes other than just to honor gods. The temple Erechtheion also had an aspect of political, social, law courts, rituals, and sacrificial purposes. Moving forward from the cities of ancient Greece, we see how these influences carried on to further civilizations and generations. The use of heavy stone materials, Greek orders, ornamental design, optimizing spatial planning, and using architecture to instigate certain movement within a community was seen and advanced in Rome, Italy. The Forum Romanum first began development by the Emperor Romulus and was continued on with each new emperor thereafter them, spanning from Julius Caesar to Emperor Augustus, and each of these emperors adding their own twist onto the Forum. The Forum was actually first conceptualized to create economical growth through centralizing all of one's needs into one area, with the possible idea that bringing all of one's needs within a close proximity of them would actually enhance their spending and buy motivation. The Forum also became a universal space that gave the city a grand identity of power and unity, whilst bringing the community together, where one could find markets, religious temples, political buildings, social events, and entertainment such as gladiatorial battles. This can also be perceived as an advancement on the Greek Agora, which looked to serve as a place mainly of trade. In the early years of the Forum, it was made up of private lots, and you would mostly find butchers. By the 4th century, there was the introduction of silversmiths and blacksmiths along the north side of the Forum. And by the late 3rd century, this had actually developed from private lots into strips of shops. On the southern side, you would find a similar layout. Furthermore, to the trade sector, there was also the construction and incorporation of temples and government buildings. Of all the buildings in the Forum, the basilica was one of the most important buildings in the area, and quite similar to the temples of ancient Greece, they would actually serve numerous functions, these being of political gatherings, law courts, and also social events and entertainment. The identity of Rome can be perceived to have a connection with the regular use of the Corinthian order. This particular order has a highly detailed top that resembles that of the acanthus root. The acanthus root is often referred to as a symbol of rebirth and new life. It is also highly consisted of grand value and prestige, which the Roman Empire often portrayed. In particular to the temples, the use of the Corinthian order may have actually been a result of placing new life and eternal life to honour the gods. As we look at the architecture of the classical world, we do begin to see the effects it had on the times in which they lived in, but also how their concepts are carried on through the future ages and styles of architecture to follow. Often included within the Renaissance era and Greek revival styles, classical architecture is still vivid amongst some of the modern day political and prestigious buildings. We find even today that architects will strive to understand the landscape and location of a project well before the first brick is even laid. We often strive for features of excellence in a project in order to provide it with its own identity, but we also aim to provide it an idea of its function before someone even steps through its doors. These are key aspects that seem evident within classical architects and the way in which they began to lay the foundations for identity and status through architecture. All over the world, from larger cities to smaller towns, we come across centralized spaces where we find markets, shopping centers, entertainment centers, and one can only wonder if the designers of the ancient Greece and Rome are responsible for the way a society moves today.